this part isn't about the nitty-gritty of how you help somebody through a claim. This part is about how universal work credit was designed and why it was designed in the way it is, and why it has ended up being what really is quite a failed, unpleasant system. And maybe what it is we as Christians can say to the world about it and to help change it. Because, I mean, if you take nothing else from what I'm going to say, it's really simple. We're all made in God's image, and somebody made in God's image should not be treated the way that universal credit claimants are. And everything else flows from that. So I'm a Methodist, and I work for the Methodist Church, and I've come to an Anglican church, so I have to bring in John Wesley. It's a rule. We can't not do it. And this was written in 1764. One reason why the rich in general have so little sympathy for the poor is because they so seldom visit them. Hence it is that one part of the world does not know what the other suffers. Many of them do not know because they do not care to know. They keep it out of the way of knowing it and then plead their voluntary ignorance as an excuse for their hardness of heart. That was written 250 years ago, and it feels as if it could be written today. So I'm just going to go through a few slides that talk to you about poverty in the UK, because universal credit should be our front line against poverty in the UK. So it's really important that we're not ignorant of it. It's really important that we understand what poverty in the UK looks like. So one of the key things is poverty is young. The most likely group to experience poverty, about 34% of children, 4.6 million children, experience poverty in the UK. The next highest groups are working age adults, and they tend to be younger working age adults. So poverty actually goes in a line from when you're young to when you're old. The least likely group to experience poverty now are pensioners. And that was around, they experienced about 16% experience poverty. And I often focus on that because in 1991, when I was at BRA, the school which you come from, pensioners were the most likely to live in poverty. But policy said, actually, that's unacceptable, that pensioners are going to live out their last years experiencing poverty, so we're going to change it. And over the next 15 years, we did. So if we say it is unacceptable that 34% of children experience poverty, we can change it. We just have to want to change it. So if we look at those working age families, one of the things you see quite quickly is that the majority of them are in working families. Now the darkest blue, that is where two parents, both working full time. The lighter blue is two parents and at least one wage coming in. And then the lightest blue is probably less than one wage coming into the household. So the majority of people who are experience poverty are in work. And then this group of about 4 million, it's a bit more now, these are pre-pandemic numbers because the numbers post-pandemic haven't settled down yet and they're kind of misleading if I use them now. They're counted as not in work, but the reason they're not in work isn't unemployment. The number unemployed sits at around 1 million and it's very churny. So you're unemployed one month and then you're in work the next month and then you're unemployed the next. The reason why there's 4 million people experiencing poverty who are out of work, it is almost exclusively illness and caring responsibilities. And then there's this group of 1 million retired, and they're counted as in poverty because their income's very low, but actually they're just living off savings, trying to run the clock out till they get to the pension. And that number increased pre-pandemic, and it's very large now. It's about 2.5 million at the moment. Now inflation's hit, they may not be able to make it till they get their pension and they may have to rejoin the labour market, but that's kind of where we are. And one of the other things is that poverty doesn't affect communities equally. So the rate for black and minority ethnic communities is much higher than the rate for white community. The rate for sick and disabled is higher, and actually it's considerably higher than that now. That's 2018 numbers. And as I say, it is children that it is most focused upon, children in large families particularly, and children in single parents that poverty is most focused on. And I'll skip past this, because I think you all, when I give this talk or talks like this to churches, often the people in the church, poverty is something they've read about. They've never met anyone who's genuinely struggling. I think the people in this room are. So that's a video of people who are genuinely struggling, because their voice needs to be heard when we do this. But I think this room is probably filled with that. And probably the most important number I'm going to show, and I can show you lots of numbers, it's a problem I have, is the next one. And it's that 53.8% of adults in receipt of universal credit skipped meals because they couldn't afford them. That's each month. Universal credit should be our bulwark against poverty, yet over half of the people who receive universal credit have to skip meals. That suggests something is going horrifically wrong. And that number has been rising for the past 3 years, but it's never been below 30%. So I thought I would show you who actually gets universal credit. So around about half of all universal credit claimants are actually in work. So half of them are, I think, as you talked about, they are working, but it's being topped up. Usually it's rent that's being topped up, and usually it's housing costs that put people over the threshold. But often it can also be with living costs as well. And for each pound you earn, your universal credit payment is removed, 54 pence of your universal credit payment is removed. So essentially you've got an effective tax rate of about 54%. The next group on universal credit tends to be people with health issues. And they tend to be the ones who are workless, or people on health issues. About 2/3 of those are long-term health issues, so they're never really expected to work. About 1/3 are on health issues which are likely to recover, so within the next 3 years are likely to go back into the labour market. But it's important to look at this and go, if you think that universal credit is about people not working, it really isn't. It's about people who can't work or are in work and low paid. Because the next largest group is people with caring responsibilities, about 1 in 10. And then you finally get to the unemployed, which is just over 1 in 10 universal credit claimants when it's fully rolled out. So it's only that group who can go to work. But as Alison said, the whole design is about getting you into work. You've got this monthly payment schedule to get you into work. But it only really applies to that group there. So I think, as Alison said, what you're doing is you're shoving these 6 benefits into one. And the reason you want to do that, and I'm going to show you a graph now that causes social scientists and a certain type of economist to just smile inwardly and feel like a warm glow. Because what happens is, when you earn money, you've got something called a work allowance if you've got children or if you've got certain medical conditions. So that's essentially tax-free. You keep all of your earnings. And then it's gradually tapered away. And since the mid-1980s, people have been desperate to have that graph in the benefit system. That has been around for over 35 years, that people have really, really wanted it to be, because they've thought that people will go out to work if they've got these, what they call consistent incentives. And that the reason they're not going out to work is that they don't have consistent incentives. And if you make work pay using this graph, then that's what will solve unemployment. And that's what people believed. And so everything else that we've learnt about it, the 5-week wait and everything else, is actually all about making sure that you've got this graph. So the aims of the system were to reduce administration costs because it all went online. And that's kind of happened. They've had to increase the administration costs because there's been all sorts of problems by putting it all online, and that the computer systems didn't work the first time, so they had to reset the whole system in 2015. But by and large, long term, they probably will make it a cheaper system to produce. They wanted to simplify the system for claimants. And I don't know, I'm not sure you can measure simplicity. I have to say, it's certainly not a simple system for claimants, whatever you say. And it kind of feels like maybe they haven't simplified it. I think one of the key things is something that Alison said, which is that if I became unemployed and wanted to claim universal credit, having been middle class, reasonably well educated, habituated to monthly paychecks, universal credit's probably quite easy for me. If, however, I have difficulties, if, however, I'm not IT literate, if I don't have a bank account, if I don't get paid on a regular basis, universal credit suddenly feels much less simple. And so it was kind of designed for people like me, yet people like me aren't its main claimants, frankly. The other thing was there was this huge, and you may remember it, there was this huge thing that said that we're filled with fraud. The benefit system is filled with fraud, and we have to reduce fraud because it's terrible. The fraud rate so the maximum amount of fraud we've ever had in the benefit system is about 2.2 billion. The average rate of fraud over the last decade in the tax system has been 32 billion, and that's only if you're generous. It's nearer 70 billion if you include some other stuff. But the priority was to reduce fraud through universal credit, and that's why you need to turn up with your driving license and everything else, is to make sure that we don't have fraud. Universal credit, however, by its very design, by lending you money on the first day that you don't get back, became the most fraud-ridden benefit system that Western Europe has ever had. Its design built in really easy opportunities for organized criminals to create fraud. So we went from a fraud rate of about 2% to the last time it was 10.5%. So basically out of every £100, over a tenner goes in fraud. Not to benefit claimants, but to people outside the benefit system exploiting its flaws. And that says something as well. And the last thing was the whole point of it, and the whole point of that graph was to make work pay so that people would go out to work, to incentivize work, and the word incentive is used a lot. And when universal credit got a really bad reputation, the Department for Work and Pensions spent around about £4 million of all our money doing an advertising campaign on the outside of Metro and various other metros throughout the country, saying how good universal credit was. And one of the claims they made was this: myth, universal credit doesn't work. It does. People move into work faster on universal credit than they did in the old system. As soon as they did that, the government had been claiming that for years on the basis of really dodgy evidence, really bad evidence. I could go into huge detail, but essentially in the best circumstances, with the easiest to help people, offering them more money than they currently do now, they managed to get a grand total of £9 extra earnings out of this easy to help group per year. And that was the basis in which they said it helps people into work. Only they changed the system after that to make it even worse. So they've got no data about how it works now and everybody else's data to say that it doesn't. So we went to the Advertising Standards Authority and we said that's a false claim. And the Advertising Standards Authority said that advertisement breached on the point of it's misleading advertising, it lacks substantiation, it needs qualification, and it's exaggeration. But other than that, it's completely true. So all of this was about that graph. And that graph doesn't work. And we know it doesn't work because there's been an experiment on 5 million of the least well-off people in the country done, proving it does not work. But there's other problems with universal credit. So we now know from studies from Liverpool and the Institute of Fiscal Studies, bar and else from Liverpool, people moving from the old benefit system to the new benefit system, their mental health is reduced. The bar data shows that there's around 5 million extra antidepressant medications given in areas where universal credit was rolled out. So we get this really interesting thing where it's rolled out in different parts of the country. So you can compare the parts where it wasn't rolled out and where it was rolled out. And then play a game of mix and match and see what the effects are. So we know food bank use went up 53% when universal credit came to town. We know that antidepressant medications went up. The bar et al. Particularly bleak and suggests that somewhere between 50 and 250 extra suicides when universal credit comes to town. Very recent data shows that there are increases in acquisitive crime, so burglary and street robbery in areas with universal credit rather than other places. And from the very early on, we got to see that there were increases in debt, utility, and council tax arrears when universal credit arrives. So, sort of when I say universal credit has failed, there is no measure that either it's set for itself or any reasonable person would set for a benefit system under which it has succeeded. The one thing that they will say, which is utterly true, which is during the pandemic, they managed to push it out to lots of people. And they say, and that's as if that justifies it. The thing is, they didn't. They pushed out a very potted form of universal credit. So the things around the ID that we talked about earlier, those ID requirements were put down. The conditionality regime and the claimant commitments, they were put down as well. So universal credit without the bad things was pushed out really quickly. Universal credit with all those other stuff has never been pushed out very quickly. So the question is, why are 53.8% of claimants skipping meals? And I think some of that we've already covered. That it's really difficult to start and maintain a claim. When I first started doing this work was when people were getting paper-based benefits. And there used to be something called brown envelope syndrome, where the brown envelope would come in and they just wouldn't open it. It was just terrifying to them. And then as universal credit began to be rolled out, you would see when my ping, I turned off the pinger on my text messages because universal credit talks to you by text message. And the ping of my phone going off was enough to cause people to shake because that was just another requirement coming into them and another requirement coming at them. So maintaining the claim and keeping up with all those pings and doing what those pings ask is really difficult. There's something called deductions. So universal credit became the debt collection agency for the entire government. So you can if you've got a debt to government, they can just attach it to your universal credit claim. And just under half of all universal credit claims have a deduction applied to them so that money is taken off. Many of them are actually mistakes from the tax credit system that happened 10 years ago, but that money's all been poured onto the universal credit system.
What other sorts of debts would you be talking about?
So it's so fines, fines, loans from DWP or social fund, council tax arrears, those sorts of things. But also, if the person can argue that you might lose your home or it's in the claimant's best interests to have it attached, any company can attach. So often utility companies can attach if they go through that process. And so can landlords, especially social landlords, find it particularly easy. So you can attach all these debt payments to this so-called minimum payment, the minimum you need to live, and they can do deductions. If you go to a food bank, you will find that around about 80% of people who come to food bank have a deduction on the universal credit. Yeah, I'll not go there. So the other thing is sanctions, and we talked about claimant commitment, and sanctions are just 98.9% are for missing an appointment or being late for an appointment. So, and if you're late for your appointment, and that's 15 minutes, what happens is that you have a month's money removed. The month's money starts from when you next go in. So if you don't know that you've missed your appointment and you don't see on your journal, it can be 2 months. So your sanction starts the day you recomply. Because universal credit is about changing people's behaviour. So you must comply or you don't get your money, whether or not you like it. And whether or not complying is in your best interests. You must comply. So at the start, it was that you could have up to 3 years sanctioning. So no money for 3 years. You could get what's called a hardship payment, which is a loan of 60% of your benefits, which you then have to repay later on. But the repayment schedule meant that 3 mistakes, which is what it took you to get to a 3-year sanction, would affect your benefit claimants for 12 and a half years, which was fairly extraordinary. And some people are still on those because although the department didn't count how many 3-year sanctions it gave out, we know that there's at least 2,500 people in the country with 3-year sanctions that will still be going on. So the idea that making people live on this amount of money is a reasonable response to being late for an appointment is unbelievable. And we did a whole report on benefit sanctions because it seemed to be the most flagrant abuse of power that you could see. So I've called these excrescences, where they break the link between the family's need and the support offered. And the reason I've called them excrescences is Lord Freud introduced them into the House of Lords. So he was the person who took the legislation through. Now, when you break the link between need and the support offered, that means there's something called the 2-child rule. So I've been I'm sure many of you may have been in a mums and Tods group, where I've been playing with 2 babies on the floor, because when you're in a mothers and toddlers group and you're me, go to the floor and stay quiet. By and large, the best advice. But I've played with 2 toddlers on the floor, one of whom's a second child, and the benefit system cared about him, and the other was a 4th child, and the benefit system said, no, you don't exist. You need no money to live. And that breaks the link. And the other one is the benefit cap. So there's a total cap of the amount of benefit you can have, which sounds like a lot of money, but if you live in a high rent area and you have disabled children or something like that, it's not a lot of money. Sorry, go on ahead.
So you mean essentially that if you're on a low income, you're sanctioned for having more children?
That's one way of putting it. Essentially, if you have more than 2 children, the phrase that they used was to make people who receive benefits face the same choices as those who support themselves solely through work. That's the phrase that's used by government. When they stole it from the Wisconsin trials, which were done in the US, in which they were really open about it. I mean, in the US, they just said, we want poor people to have less children. That's why they did it.
Only rich people.
Indeed. Now, the irony is, and I probably shouldn't go off on one, but I will. The irony is, in those Wisconsin trials, what happened was you didn't see a drop in fertility rate. In fact, amongst women with least power, they ended up having more children, because when you remove power from women, they are less able to say no to having more children. So ostensibly this was about making women have less children, but in fact what it did was in Wisconsin for black women had more children. And that is, but we imported it anyway. And the reason the minister this year said these policies were excrescences. He introduced them and he described them as an excrescence that pulled really well. And number 10 made me do it because they pulled really well. And you might have a little bit of respect for him in saying that, only he said it in a House of Lords debate, and the next sentence was about how you could find out about it in the book that he'd written. The words I used were decidedly un-Methodist. So anyway, so that's another reason. And that's why particularly families with large numbers of children have this high rate. Really, really key is straightforwardly, even it's a brutal system that's hard to get in and doesn't really look at need very well. But if it was well funded, it might not be a problem. If you threw enough money at it, you could probably cope with that. The thing is that universal credit was allowed to shrink. So it was frozen, which meant that inflation ate away at it for 5 years. So now the basic rate of universal credit is at the same level that unemployment benefits were in 1990. So the average income has increased by over 50% since then, but universal credit has stayed flat. And that's why people can't, even when they go through all of this minefield, they can't afford to feed themselves every day of the month. And the Chancellor in the autumn statement said he was proud to be in a nation that had a welfare state like ours. Again, on Methodist language. Because of the 20 OECD countries, the 20 G20 countries, we are 17th behind the US and Greece. That's where we are. Everyone else gives the replacement rate, the sort of how much you get if you lose your job, is higher. And for good reason. And I've put this on at the end. This is work we did this summer. That if you look at the amount of money that people have this winter over last winter, a family of 4 receiving universal credit will be £1,400 worse off. So that's before the £1,400 drop. You've got a 53.8%. So we spent a large amount of time lobbying prior to the autumn statement. And it looked as if universal credit wasn't even going to be uprated in line with inflation. And so our mild win was that it would stay in line with prices. But it doesn't do anything for that 1,400 quid.
This is very depressing.
I go and bring joy everywhere. I'll do this one. This is funny.
I was feeling pretty rubbish before I came here to see you.
I bring joy everywhere. This one's at least funny. This is where it comes from. This is a form of economics. And I sent this to, one of my colleagues got married this year, and I sent this to them. Because this is an economist view of marriage. It's Gary Becker's theory, and it says that incentives are everything. So you may not know, there may be some married people in this who didn't do the maths, shame on you. But what we have to do is use this payoff matrix showing the maximum household commodity output that can be produced by any combination of M and F. That is how some economists think we make decisions. And they think they can believe these decisions. They think that you just have to change the commodity output and that will change how humans behave.
But this is the dominant way that economists...
Yeah, this is neoclassical economics. This is Gary Becker.
Right?
No, he got a Nobel Prize in 1993 for this. So that was the thinking that went to universal credit. That's why we have that graph. Because they looked at people and they said, all we have to do is provide consistent financial incentives and we can create marriages, and we can create jobs, and we can do almost everything else. And it works as long as you choose not to meet a human. If you meet a human, you discover that they get married for all sorts of reasons. If you meet a human, and especially if you go to sit and have a cup of tea in a food bank, or I assume in brunch that you were talking about, as soon as you have a cup of tea, you realize that actually, they don't need a consistent incentive. They need somebody to look after their kids. They don't need a consistent incentive. They need to learn how to read. They don't need a consistent incentive. They've just been battered by life and they need to recover. And that is what a welfare system should accommodate, rather than this strange economic view. It was designed to do the wrong thing. It was designed to change people who didn't need change. They need help. Because it was designed by the wrong people. I am the wrong person to design a welfare system. I can help people who experience poverty to design a welfare system, but it shouldn't be me doing it, and it shouldn't be the people who we traditionally give that job to. And so the churches are working with things called Poverty Truth Commissions about the country to help design a welfare system based on their experience. That understands that the reason people can't get into work are myriad and are nothing to do with that damned graph. Go ahead.
It's dismantling the welfare state, no? Like, this is also part of a certain ideology around the role of the state in our society, right?
So when the welfare state was first envisaged in this beautiful, beautiful piece. It was written in the mid-60s. And it talks about the welfare state as an insurance system. And it says how wonderful it is for a society, and it doesn't talk really about poverty. It says how wonderful it is for a society because it means people can take risks. If you know that maybe if I move jobs to here and it doesn't work out, I'll be all right. I'll be caught. It enables people to take risks, to move, to maybe go and help someone for less money somewhere else, to spend time with family. All of those things that make life worth living. If you have a system that catches you, you're free to do those things. And that was the vision that was in the welfare state to begin with. That's what Beveridge talks about. That's what Temple talks about. Archbishop Temple, who sort of wrote the moral case for the welfare state. But all of the talk today is about residualizing it. It's about saying it's really only about giving the minimum amount of people to absolutely avoid destitution for the smallest price that we possibly can. And yeah, that's about saying the state wants to withdraw. And I personally believe I pay taxes in order to not withdraw from the rest of society. And I think by and large that's the church's view as well.
It's not even that they don't know people who are in poverty, it's that they've demonized them.
One of the really fascinating things we do is that that's actually probably not true. that we live such different lives that the people who write those stories, and I mean, I wrote something called Truth and Lies About Poverty 10 years ago now, about how the demonization was done and how they used, why I got into the numbers of it was because they used numbers to tell unpleasant stories. But the one thing that changed that interaction was when you got two people in the same room. And it is actually that human interaction, and it's something that churches can do. And you see it in churches that ran food banks. You'd have this nice middle-class church, and they were going to do good things to these poor, unfortunate people. And they, by and large, had this view that the market was right. These people have no money because basically they're not good enough to have a lot of money. But we might help them such that they will become good enough to have enough money, and that'll be great. And they weren't on the other end of that, which is they're not good enough to have enough money, and so we should punish them into it. They were, by and large, they weren't there. But after a decade of handing out more and more food parcels, if you go to those places now, I was at a Trussell meeting and 10 years ago it was very, very prim and middle class, and it was all very nice. And if you talked about politics, it was just like, This time, I sort of give a talk similar to this, talking about the injustices of the welfare state, and they were haranguing me for being too gentle. Because once you've been in that room with enough people, you know this can't stand.
How many years does it take for a church to become like that?
It depends on the church, it depends on the people they meet. Often it takes one person who's eloquent. Often it takes one person who they like to invite them in. But it takes a while, but I have to say, within the food bank movement, within the debt centre movement, that journey has gone. And I don't think it's got into the pews, certainly not in our church, in the Methodist church, as much as I would like, but it is moving. Big thing of sanctions in the 1920s, you saw in the 1980s, and you saw it again in the 2010s. You have an economic crisis, which impoverishes many. And the first reaction is sympathy. It's not your fault that you're here. We want to provide some help. We think we're fine. Very quickly, it goes to, well, get on your bike. Him down the road's fine now, so why aren't you? And it goes to blame very quickly. And you saw that in all of those instances. And I used to think, and I think it's partly true, and it's what I wrote about it 10 years ago, was that it's because people in power don't want to accept responsibility. Because frankly, I was running this show when it all went wrong. And these are the people bearing the consequences for it. And I don't want to accept responsibility. I also don't want to spend money, so it's easier to take money off people you don't like. So I'll make you not like them. I think that's true. But the really interesting thing is that if you look at the attitudes data, and we've got really good quality data from the 80s and the 90s, you see public attitudes go the same way, and they're often not driven by the narrative in the newspapers, that the public attitude, if anything, it's the other way. And I think that there's a lot of it is about what I feel when I've come back home from a food bank. I come home from a food bank and I open my fridge, and there's something that's gone off in the corner that I've wasted. And there's other food, and I'm choosing what snack to have. And that feels awful. That really feels awful. And I think if you live in a society where there is that much poverty, if you know that there are people who aren't eating, it's emotionally protective to say they're bad people. And it isn't just the media, it is us that say that. And I think it's really important to just sit with that and recognize it. And when you open your fridge and you feel bad, and you may, after having heard this, go home and open your fridge and feel bad if it is full of rotting food or whatever, it's really important to say, yeah, you should feel bad. We should feel bad we live in a country where people aren't eating. Now, the solution isn't then to beat myself up. The solution then is to go out and do something about it. But you can see it in the right-wing press. You can see that that trend is beginning to happen this time. And so next year will be about why aren't they out at work, even though they're sick? Because the big increase in benefits is people with long COVID, people with, there's 7 million people in NHS waiting lists, people waiting for treatment. But it will very soon be, why aren't they out at work? And I think we have to recognise that and recognise where it comes from. And most importantly, yeah, the politicians and the press should know better, they should do their research. But the person who sits next to you at the pew, who is seduced by that argument, just telling them wrong probably isn't going to work. Empathising with that pain that they're feeling and then taking them from there might just work. Sorry.
So if there's one thing that you want churches, that you could say, okay, I'd love all churches to do one thing in the next year, what would it be?
I'll go for a 2-point thing. I talked to you about this campaign. And that it says that universal credit, that nobody should have a deduction or sanction such that they go below it where they can avoid destitution. And when I say so they avoid destitution, you think, how low have our ambitions gone? That is what we're asking for, and it feels like asking for the moon. But the second point is to live with that, and the second point is to recognize that if we are created in God's image, God does not want people to live in poverty. It is unacceptable in a rich country like ours that people live in poverty. The last decade, we went from a couple 100,000 people experiencing destitution to 1.5 million in 2015 to just before the pandemic, 2.5 million. At the same time, the average income went from 28,000 to 34,000. The average wealth per household went 200,000 to 300,000. The stock exchange increased 50%. The money was there, we chose not to do that. The joining in that campaign should be part of understanding that poverty is a result of the choices we've made. It is not that we're in a recession and then we have to accept it. We have chosen this, and we reject those who choose it on our behalf.